In 1971, one man won 6 out of 8 NHRA pro stock races in a single season. He set national records. He went to finals that other drivers had given up trying to reach. He was so fast, so consistent, so untouchable that the people running the most powerful drag racing organization in America sat down at the end of that year, looked at the results, and made a decision. They were going to change the rules. Not to make the sport safer. Not to fix something that was broken. But specifically, deliberately, and openly, to slow down one man and one engine before they made the entire concept of competition meaningless. His name was Ronnie Sox. His car was a Plymouth Barracuda with a 426 Hemi under the hood. And what NHRA did to him going into the 1972 season is one of the most audacious acts of institutional overreach in the history of American motorsport. They added over 100 pounds to his car while his competitors got lighter. They rewrote the class structure to favor the people he had been beating. They changed the game, mid-game, because they had run out of any other way to slow him down. This is that story. And it starts not in 1971 or 1972, but in a small town in North Carolina, at a gas station, where a skinny kid named Ronnie Sox was learning to drive before he was old enough to have a license. Burlington, North Carolina. 1950s. A small southern town where the biggest things happening on a Friday night were either at the church or down at the end of the road, where the boys were lining up their cars and figuring out who had the fastest machine in the county. Willard Ronald Sox grew up in what was widely regarded as the Whiskey Belt. Long before he was old enough to legally drive, young Ronnie was already sneaking out at night, pushing cars down the rural roads, trying to match the speed and skill of local moonshine runners. His father ran a Sinclair gas station on Church Street in Burlington, and from the time he was 11 years old, Ronnie was under hoods, turning wrenches, learning how engines breathed and why some of them lived and some of them died under hard acceleration. His first car was a 1932 Plymouth Coupe that his father purchased for him before he could drive legally. It was in this car that Ronnie began practicing his shifting skills and how to adjust a clutch for the right feel and engagement. That detail matters. Because what would eventually make Ronnie Sox the most feared driver in pro stock history wasn't horsepower alone. It was his hands. Specifically, it was what those hands did with a 4-speed manual transmission at maximum RPM, under maximum pressure, when everything was on the line. By 1958, Sox had gotten serious about racing. He purchased a Chevy with a 348 cubic inch V8, pulled the motor, made modifications, and proceeded to win 48 consecutive races, securing the track championship. 48 consecutive wins. At his local track. Before most of the country had ever heard his name. When organized drag racing started expanding across the South, Ronnie Sox expanded with it. He raced Fords, Pontiacs, Chevrolets. He drove anything that was fast and available. And the reputation followed him everywhere he went. This was a man who did not lose races he was supposed to win. Buddy Martin's career started in 1952 at 16 years old, beginning with a 1939 Ford Coupe that he took completely apart to learn how the engine worked. Martin was a businessman and a promoter and a team builder. He understood the commercial side of drag racing in ways that most drivers never bothered to learn. He understood that winning races was one business and that building a team people would pay to watch was an entirely different and equally important business. The moment that created drag racing history was simple. Buddy Martin tried to beat Ronnie Sox on the track. He failed. He tried again. He failed again. And at some point Buddy Martin made the most intelligent decision of his career. Instead of trying to beat Ronnie Sox, he asked Ronnie Sox to drive his car. Martin approached Sox to drive for him after concluding that he simply couldn't beat him. They became one of the most well-known teams in drag racing history. Sox provided the hands and the throttle instinct. Martin provided the organization, the sponsorship, the logistics, and the business sense. And Jake King, the third essential piece of the Sox and Martin machine, provided the engine. Born John Preston King in Burlington, North Carolina, Jake grew up on a farm where his father and uncle operated a small garage. He learned the importance of being meticulous when assembling an engine. His attention to being thorough, along with the insistence of having a spotless build room, proved invaluable to the success of his engines and how they performed. King was the kind of engine builder who understood that the difference between winning and losing at the highest levels of drag racing was measured in fractions, fractions of a second, fractions of an inch, fractions of a horsepower, and that those fractions came from the details that most people considered too small to matter. He was also, apparently, a man with a sense of humor. Virtually all of the Hemi engines in the Sox and Martin race cars were painted Ford blue. 3 men from Burlington, North Carolina. 1 car, 1 mission, and the most dominant engine in the history of American drag racing sitting in the engine bay. But here is what the official record doesn't fully capture. Ronnie Sox didn't just win races. He won them in ways that made other professional drivers question whether they had chosen the right profession. And the season that finally forced NHRA's hand was not the result of some new technological breakthrough or some trick that nobody else had access to. It was the result of one man being, simply and undeniably, better than everyone else in the class. And that, in the politics of sanctioned motorsport, is sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be. To understand what happened in 1971, you need to understand what pro stock was and what it was supposed to be. NHRA introduced the pro stock class in 1970. The idea was to create the ultimate heads-up door slammer category, full-bodied production cars, factory-based engines, no funny car aerodynamics, no exotic fuel, no blower hanging out of the hood. Just a production automobile built to the absolute limit of the rules, driven by the best drivers in the country, running side by side with no handicap and no excuses. The fastest car wins. The first NHRA Pro Stock event was the 1970 Winter Nationals in Pomona, where Bill Jenkins defeated Ronnie Sox in the final, 9.99 to 10.12. It was a statement that the class was going to be competitive and that no single team was going to walk in and take over. Jenkins, known throughout the sport as grumpy because of his perpetually irritated demeanor and his habit of being unpleasant to anyone who asked him a question he considered stupid, was the other dominant figure in those early pro stock years. He was a brilliant engine builder, a methodical tuner, and deeply respected by everyone in the pits even if nobody particularly enjoyed talking to him. But after that first race, the balance of power shifted. Sox and Martin became multi-event pro stock winners in 1970 and 1971 with their Plymouth Cuda. The Hemi-powered Barracuda, prepared by Jake King and driven by Ronnie Sox, began doing to pro stock what the 426 Hemi had done to super stock 6 years earlier. It started winning. Consistently. Repeatedly, in ways that made the competition feel not competitive but simply ceremonial. Sox dominated the new category, winning 9 of the 15 NHRA national events held across the 1970 and 1971 seasons. At the end of 1970, the weekly paper Drag News proclaimed Ronnie Sox as Pro Stock Driver of the Year. In the 1970 Pro Stock class, Ronnie Sox power shifted the Hemi Cuda past the fields of 14 major championship events. The 10 AHRA and 4 NHRA titles made him the dual world champion and the only driver ever to win 4 consecutive championships. Think about that number. 4 consecutive championships across 2 sanctioning bodies. In 1 year, the man was not just winning races, he was making the entire competitive landscape look theoretical. Ronnie Sox won the 1970 NHRA Pro Stock World Championship. And then 1971 arrived. If 1970 had been impressive, 1971 was something else entirely. Sox won 6 of the 8 pro stock events in 1971. He won the season's first 3 races, the Winter Nationals, Gator Nationals, and Spring Nationals. 3 in a row to open the season. The competition wasn't just losing. They were losing early, often, and without any obvious explanation for why their cars couldn't close the gap. Sox went on to win Le Grand National, where he reset the national record at 9.52 seconds, and the U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis, his second Indy triumph. He was defeated only once in the entire season when he was actually outrun by the competition. One time all season. He was actually outrun one time. Of the final 8 rounds of NHRA Pro Stock that season, Sox and his 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda were entered into 6 of them and won each one. Victories at Pomona, Gainesville, Dallas, Montreal, Indianapolis, and Ontario signaled true dominance, one which NHRA determined would never occur again for the Hemi engine. Now pause on that sentence. NHRA determined it would never occur again. Not that they were going to try to make the competition better, not that they were going to find ways to bring more competitive cars into the field, but that this specific outcome, a Hemi-powered Mopar winning at this level of dominance, was something they were going to prevent through rulemaking. On November 21, 1970, Ronnie Sox became the first person to run 140 miles per hour at the end of the quarter mile in an NHRA Pro Stock car, running 140.18 miles per hour at Ontario, California. He wasn't just faster than everyone else in the class. He was making history that nobody else was capable of making. And yet, despite 6 wins in 8 races in 1971, despite the national records, despite the dominance that every single person in the sport could see with their own eyes, Sox won 6 of the 8 events and still didn't win the championship. He experienced a flat tire and a stunning loss to unheralded Ronnie Sox in round 2 of the Summer Nationals. Fonz went on to beat the Sox and Martin team car of Herb McCandless in the final of the World Finals, 10.05 to 10.40, to steal the World Championship. The championship that year went to Mike Fonz. Not because Fonz was faster than Sox on most days, but because the championship was determined by the single World Finals event, and Fonz won that event. It was a technicality of how the championship structure worked that year, and everyone in the sport understood it as such. But here is what that detail reveals about what was coming. Even without the championship, Sox and Martin's 1971 season was so visually, statistically, and undeniably dominant that NHRA could not ignore it. Numerous racers felt the team was unstoppable, and it eventually forced NHRA to make adjustments in the pro stock class for the 1972 season. The question wasn't whether NHRA was going to respond. The question was how far they were willing to go. What NHRA did going into 1972 was not a subtle adjustment. It was not a modest recalibration. It was a systematic rewriting of the weight rules that specifically targeted the Hemi engine while simultaneously giving preferential treatment to smaller engines in smaller cars. And the man who benefited most from those new rules, Bill Jenkins, arrived at the 1972 Winter Nationals in a car that bore almost no resemblance to anything a customer could walk into a Chevrolet dealer and buy. What happened next revealed everything about who the NHRA rulebook was really written to protect. The 1972 NHRA Pro Stock rule changes were published before the season began, and they were not hidden. NHRA didn't pretend this was about safety or technical compliance or the integrity of the production car concept. They made the reasoning fairly clear. The Hemi-powered Chrysler cars had been too dominant for 2 seasons. The rules needed to change to restore competitive balance. Here is exactly what they did. NHRA kept the existing 7 pounds per cubic inch brake for cars with staggered valve wedge engines like the 396 Chevy and 427, 454, and 351 Cleveland Fords, but applied a 7.25 pound brake to the Hemis and to the SOHC and 429 Boss Ford engines. At 426 cubic inches, that amounted to a 106 pound weight increase for the Hemi, added specifically to the Hemi-powered cars, while competitors with conventional wedge engines carried the same weight they always had. But that was only the beginning. In addition to the weight penalty on the Hemi, NHRA added a 6.75 pound brake for smaller wedge engines such as the 302, 327, and 350 Chevys and the 340 Chrysler. Cars with a wheelbase of less than 100 inches, such as the Pintos, Vegas, Colts, and Gremlins, were allowed a minimum weight of 2,000 pounds as long as they used engines of 366 cubic inches or smaller. Read that again carefully. Compact cars with small block engines were now allowed to run at 2,000 pounds minimum weight. The Hemi-powered Barracudas and Dusters that Sox and Martin were running, larger cars with the 426 Hemi, were now carrying a dramatically different weight burden. Jenkins' 330-inch small block and Ronnie Sox's 426-inch Hemi made essentially the same horsepower per cubic inch. Yet Jenkins could get his car down to 2,200 pounds legally while a Mopar was tipping the scales at 3,100. Let that land for a moment. Same horsepower per cubic inch, 900 pounds difference in minimum weight. That is not a competitive balance adjustment. That is a systematic dismantling of one team's ability to win. And the car that Jenkins arrived at the 1972 Winter Nationals with was not a production-based muscle car in any conventional sense. A huge step towards moving out of the spirit of a factory hot rod movement came in 1972 when Bill Jenkins debuted a tube chassis race car at the NHRA Winter Nationals. The real departure was that Jenkins put a V8 in a subcompact Vega, a combination that had never been available from the factory and was never going to be available from the factory. A tube chassis, meaning the entire structural foundation of the car was a custom fabricated racing frame with no connection to the production Vega that Chevrolet sold at dealerships. It was a race car wearing a Vega body, and NHRA had specifically written rules that allowed it to compete. The lower displacement engine in the smaller car, hence lighter minimum weight, enabled it to outrun the larger engined but heavier cars. Jenkins set a class record. The results at the 1972 Winter Nationals told the story with brutal clarity. Jenkins' Vega had tuning problems that held him to a qualifying best of 9.90, putting him in 17th position in the 32-car field. He was forced to race Stu McDade's Dodge Challenger that had qualified number 1 with a 9.59. But Jenkins made pivotal suspension changes prior to round 1 and managed a 9.63 to defeat McDade's 9.75. Jenkins went on to defeat 4 more Hemi-powered cars to score the victory. He qualified 17th, went to the back of the field, and beat 5 Hemi cars on his way to winning the race, including the car that had qualified fastest in the entire field, on a day when his car was not at its best. That win was the first of 6 wins in 8 races that earned Jenkins the 1972 NHRA Pro Stock Championship. 6 wins in 8 races. Sound familiar? That is exactly what Ronnie Sox had done in 1971, and it had been the number that triggered the rule changes. Now Bill Jenkins was doing it with a car that bore the same statistical signature of dominance, except this time, NHRA did not respond with weight penalties. This time, the dominant car was a Chevrolet, and the rules stayed exactly where they were. Only Don Carlton was able to score a win for Mopar in 1972, while Bill Jenkins won 6 times for Chevy. 1 win for all of Chrysler's teams combined. 6 wins for 1 Chevy driver. And no rule changes followed. Chrysler had seen this pattern before. They had lived through the 1965 NHRA ban on the race Hemi. They had watched the same institutional logic play out. Dominance by a Mopar triggers rule changes. Dominance by a competitor does not. At the U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis in 1972, the Chrysler Corporation had had enough with the new weight break rules and asked their factory team members to stay away from the race. Another boycott. Another protest. Another declaration that the playing field was not level and that Chrysler was not going to pretend it was. For Ronnie Sox personally, the impact of the 1972 rules was profound and permanent. Legendary driver Ronnie Sox would never win another NHRA national event following the 1971 season, nor would any 426 Hemi win another Pro Stock World Championship. Read that sentence carefully. Ronnie Sox, the man who had won 9 national events in 23 starts across the 1970 to 1972 era, the man who had been the single most dominant driver in the class since its creation, the man who had run times that no one else in the field could match, never won another NHRA national event after the rules changed. The Hemi never again produced a Pro Stock World Champion. Not because the engine had gotten slower. Not because Sox had lost his ability. Not because Jake King had forgotten how to build an engine. Because the rules had been written to make it effectively impossible. To restore parity, NHRA forced Chrysler Pro Stockers to carry more than 200 extra pounds compared to their Chevrolet and Ford rivals. Sox and Martin did not give up without a fight. They were too professional and too competitive for that. After early struggles with their updated Cuda, Sox and Martin returned to their North Carolina shop and began constructing a new 1972 Plymouth Duster Pro Stock. Starting from a body in white, the car was acid-dipped to cut weight. Compared to the Cuda, the Plymouth Duster was narrower and offered better aerodynamics, giving the team an edge despite NHRA's restrictions. They went back to basics. They built a new car from scratch, using every technique available to them to recover the weight disadvantage they had been handed. They found a narrower body. They stripped everything they could legally strip. They brought every tool in Jake King's arsenal to bear on the problem. While Sox and Martin faced challenges in NHRA events due to the added weight penalties, they found more success in IHRA races, where rules favored the Hemi engines. And there it is. The clearest proof of what was really happening. In the IHRA, the International Hot Rod Association, a separate sanctioning body with different rules, the Hemi-powered cars were still winning. The engine hadn't changed. The driver hadn't changed. The team hadn't changed. Only the rulebook had changed, and where the rulebook was written fairly, Sox and Martin were still competitive. The NHRA rulebook, written specifically to address Hemi dominance, had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had taken the fastest car and the best driver in the class and handed the championship to someone else. As the years went on, rule changes added weight penalties to Hemi engine-powered Mopar vehicles, making their Plymouths and Dodges increasingly uncompetitive against lighter Chevrolets and Fords, which benefited from more favorable cubic inch-to-weight ratios. Eventually, Buddy Martin officially requested termination of the team's contract with Chrysler. At a time when the corporation was already cutting back its motorsports budget, there was no effort to stop them. The team's iconic cars were sold off, marking the true end of an unforgettable era. By the late 1970s, the country was dealing with a recession due to dire economic conditions and lack of consumer confidence. Virtually all corporate sponsorship dried up, and by 1979, the Sox and Martin team disbanded. What had begun in a Sinclair gas station in Burlington, North Carolina, ended in a recession-battered America where the money had dried up and the rules had made winning nearly impossible. 2 men from a small southern town who had built the most dominant team in the history of pro stock drag racing had been systematically engineered out of the sport they had helped create. Ronnie Sox died on April 22, 2006, in Richmond, Virginia, after a battle with prostate cancer. He was 67 years old. He was ranked 15th on the NHRA's top 50 drivers of the 20th century. Among every driver who ever competed in any class, in any era, across the entire history of the organization, Ronnie Sox is in the top 15. In 1970, Sox and Martin dominated the inaugural Pro Stock season, collecting 3 of the 7 event titles en route to a world championship. They doubled the win total in 1971, taking home 6 victories. And in 2007, the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America inducted Sox and Martin together, not just as great racers, but as one of the most significant teams in the history of the sport. A sport that had done everything in its institutional power to slow them down, and had ultimately succeeded, not by building faster cars, but by writing rules. The 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda that Ronnie Sox drove to those 6 victories, the car that triggered the rule changes, the car that NHRA decided could not be allowed to continue winning at that pace, exists today as one of the most important artifacts in American drag racing history. When it went to auction at Mecum, it was expected to bring between $850,000 and $1.1 million. It had been completely restored to its 1971 racing configuration with the traditional Sox and Martin red, white, and blue paint scheme, featuring the full race 426 Hemi equipped with dual-plug cylinder heads and a dual quad intake, and the 4-speed transmission that Ronnie himself ran through the gears. The rules couldn't stop it. The weight penalties couldn't stop it. The boycotts and the protests and the institutional pressure couldn't stop it. The car that NHRA tried to sideline in 1972 now sits in a collection somewhere worth more than most people will earn in their entire lives. Because here is the truth that no rulebook can change. Ronnie Sox was the best driver in Pro Stock during the era when Pro Stock was the most exciting class in drag racing. Jake King built the best engine. Buddy Martin ran the best team. And the 426 Hemi, tuned by a man who painted it Ford blue just to make people ask questions, was the best engine in the class, by a margin that the entire machinery of NHRA's rule-making apparatus spent 3 years trying to erase. Plymouth's advertising in 1965, when NASCAR had banned the Hemi, said it best. And it applied just as accurately in 1972 as it had 7 years earlier. If you can't beat them, outlaw them. That was not an accusation. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was a fact. And the timing sheets from 1970 and 1971, sitting in the NHRA archives, prove it beyond any reasonable argument. Ronnie Sox was not slowed down because he had an unfair advantage. He was slowed down because he was too good. And in the strange political world of sanctioned motorsport, sometimes those two things are the same. Now here is something I want you to sit with for just a moment before we close out. The story of Sox and Martin and the 1972 rule changes is not an isolated incident. It is not a historical anomaly. It is a pattern that has repeated itself in NHRA drag racing from the very first year the Hemi appeared at a sanctioned event. When a Mopar dominates, the rules change. When another manufacturer dominates under those new rules, the rules stay where they are. The history books are full of this pattern, and we have barely scratched the surface of it. If you want to follow that thread, and I promise you it goes deep and it goes long and there are stories in there that will make you shake your head, stick around. Because the next story involves the Chrysler factory team's full-scale war against NHRA's rule structure in the years after 1972. The political battles that went on in those years, the deals that were made and broken, and the way it all finally ended. It is the chapter of drag racing history that most people have never heard told from start to finish. If this one moved you the way it moves me every time I go back through the history, hit subscribe. That button is there for a reason. Use it and hit the like button if you want more people to find this kind of storytelling, because that is exactly what it does. These are American stories. The men who lived them deserve to have them told right. That is what we are here to do. I will see you on the next one.